the heart of Charleston, South Carolina, among the historic homes with their wraparound porches and swaying Spanish moss, lived a woman named Barbara. She was a widow, having lost her husband years ago, leaving her alone in the quiet house that had once been filled with love and laughter. Barbara was also partially blind, her vision diminished to little more than shadows and blurry shapes by years of too many corrective eye surgeries. Despite this, Barbara had learned to navigate her world with the help of her other senses and her loyal dog, Pete. Pete was her constant companion. Though Barbara had never seen him clearly, she knew him by the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers, the comforting pressure of his head resting on her lap, and the steady presence at her feet as she watched her favorite television shows. The old classics like The Golden Girls and The Andy Griffith Show. Pete was everything to Barbara, her protector, her friend, her family. She would rub his belly, give him treats, and smile, imagining the joy in his eyes as his tail thumped against the floor. She would rub his belly, give him treats, and smile, imagining the joy in his eyes as his tail thumped against the floor. But on one particular Saturday evening, as Barbara settled into her favorite armchair with Pete at her feet, the stillness of the night was about to be shattered. Outside, 3 men lurked in the shadows, their eyes fixed on Barbara's home. They were young and desperate, looking for an easy target. They had heard about the old blind widow who lived alone, and they saw an opportunity to make a quick score. They didn't know about Pete. The leader of the group, a man with a cruel smirk and cold eyes, gestured for his accomplices to follow him as they approached the house. The plan was simple: break in, subdue the old woman, and take whatever they could find. Easy, or so they thought. As Barbara watched her television, Pete's ears perked up. He sensed something, an unfamiliar presence approaching the house. He didn't move, but his muscles tensed, his attention focused on the front door. Barbara, oblivious to the impending danger, continued watching her show, lost in the familiar voices of the characters she loved. The men reached the porch, their footsteps nearly silent on the old wooden boards. The leader knocked on the door, his voice smooth and deceptive. "Ma'am, is anyone home? We're with the neighborhood watch, just checking on everyone." Barbara, ever trusting, slowly rose from her chair. She hesitated for a moment, something about the voice causing a flicker of doubt, but she dismissed it. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice gentle but cautious. "Just checking on the neighborhood, ma'am. Mind if we come in for a moment?" Pete stood up, his eyes fixed on the door, his body a taut line of tension. Barbara reached for the doorknob, and the moment she turned it, the men shoved their way inside, knocking her to the ground. She cried out in pain and fear, her world spinning as she tried to understand what was happening. And then from the darkness, Pete growled, a deep rumbling sound that reverberated through the room, freezing the men in their tracks. The leader turned, his bravado faltering as he saw the shadowy figure of the dog stepping forward, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Is that a dog?" one of the men whispered, his voice trembling. Pete's growl deepened, his lips pulling back to reveal sharp, gleaming teeth. He advanced slowly, each step deliberate, his eyes locked on the intruders. The men didn't know what it was, but there was something in those eyes, something that made their blood run cold. The leader, trying to regain control, sneered. "It's just a dog. Let's take care of it and get what we came for." But as he reached for the gun tucked into his waistband, Pete lunged. He moved with a speed and ferocity that was almost supernatural, his massive jaws snapping shut around the man's arm. The leader screamed as Pete dragged him to the ground, the sound of bones crunching filling the air. As the leader writhed in agony, Pete released him just long enough to look him in the eyes. The man's vision cleared for a brief moment, and in that instant he saw Pete, not as a dog, but as something far more terrifying. The creature's eyes burned with an unnatural fire, and its form seemed to grow, looming over him like a shadow from the deepest pit of hell. "You should not have hurt her," Pete growled, his voice no longer the growl of an animal, but a deep, resonant tone that echoed with ancient power. "For your sins, your soul is forfeit." The man's eyes widened in horror. "What are you?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Pete leaned closer, his breath hot and fetid against the man's face. "I am your punishment, the last thing you will see before you are dragged into the darkness. Your soul will burn for eternity, never to find peace, only suffering and despair." The leader's scream was cut short as Pete tore into him, his body convulsing as the life drained from him. The other 2 men, frozen in terror, tried to flee, but Pete was upon them before they could take a step. He pounced, his massive paws pinning one to the ground, his teeth ripping through flesh as if it were paper. The man's screams echoed through the house, but they were soon silenced as Pete dispatched him with brutal efficiency. "Please, I didn't want to hurt her. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Pete advanced slowly, his eyes fixed on the man's, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Your apologies mean nothing. You came here with malice in your heart, and now you will pay the price. Your soul will be damned, cast into the pit to suffer for all eternity. There is no escape from what you've done." With a final, blood-curdling scream, the man tried to run, but Pete caught him, dragging him into the shadows. The house was filled with the sound of tearing flesh, the wet crunch of bones breaking, and then silence. Barbara, still dazed from the fall, slowly sat up. The room was eerily quiet, save for the faint sounds of the television in the background. She called out for Pete, her voice trembling, but she couldn't see him in the darkness. A moment later, Pete emerged from the shadows, his fur matted with blood, his eyes still glowing faintly. He approached Barbara, his form shrinking back to the size of the dog she knew. Gently, he nudged her hand with his nose, and she stroked his head, her touch soothing the monstrous creature back into its dormant state. "Good boy, Pete. Good boy," she murmured, unaware of the horrors that had just taken place in her home. Pete lay back down at her feet as she struggled to return to her armchair, his eyes watching the door, ensuring that no more threats would come near her. To Barbara, Pete was just her faithful companion, a dog who loved her and kept her company in her lonely world. She would never know the truth, never see the blood or the bodies, never understand the darkness that had protected her. But those who dared to harm her would see, just before the end, the Hellhound's true form, and they would hear his voice, the last sound they would ever hear, as he condemned their souls to an eternity of torment. Thank you for joining us at PK Booksmarts. If this story sent chills down your spine, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Follow us on all social platforms for more tales that explore the eerie, the unsettling, and the macabre. Until next time, beware of the shadows. You never know what might be lurking in the dark.